She was 7 months pregnant, swinging a framing hammer in the freezing Washington rain, entirely alone. Clara thought she had escaped the worst of her past by building a sanctuary completely off the grid. But she didn't know these ancient woods already belonged to someone else, someone who had ruled in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest for centuries. When the lonely immortal king stepped from the tree line, he didn't bring death. He looked at her swollen belly, his crimson eyes softening, and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." The tires of Clara Jenkins' 2018 Subaru Forester crunched aggressively against the gravel of the unpaved logging road, kicking up a rooster tail of mud and dead pine needles. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles bruised white, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. There was no one behind her. There hadn't been a single pair of headlights following her since she passed the rusted welcome sign for Sedro-Woolley, Washington, nearly an hour ago. Still, the phantom anxiety remained. Her ex-fiancé David had a terrifying knack for finding her. He had tracked her to a cramped apartment in Seattle and then to a rented basement in Tacoma. But this time, Clara had completely disappeared. She had paid for her burner phone in cash at a Walgreens, abandoned her bank accounts, and used a shell LLC she set up under her mother's maiden name to purchase 5 acres of forgotten, heavily forested land in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. Clara pressed a hand to her swollen stomach, feeling a sharp rolling kick against her palm. She was 28 weeks along, and the sheer physical exhaustion of pregnancy was beginning to wage a brutal war against her adrenaline. "Just a little further, Peanut," she whispered to the empty car, the sound of the heater blasting against the windshield, the only other noise in the vehicle. "We're almost home. Nobody is ever going to hurt us again." The property was entirely unimproved. When Clara had bought it from a gruff, chain-smoking local real estate broker named Gary Henderson, he had warned her against it. "It's raw land, miss. No well, no septic, no grid power for miles. The locals don't even hunt out that far. They say the woods there are too quiet," Gary had muttered, stamping out his Marlboro. But Clara hadn't cared. Quiet was exactly what she needed. She parked the Subaru in a small clearing she had managed to hack away with a rented brush mower 3 weeks prior. Stepping out into the biting October chill, Clara immediately felt the damp, heavy silence of the ancient forest. Towering Douglas firs and massive red cedars loomed on all sides, creating a natural fortress that blocked out the pale afternoon sun. Her breath plumed in the cold air as she walked to the rear hatch of the Subaru, popping it open to reveal a chaotic jumble of survival supplies. Heavy-duty blue tarps, a portable Honda EU2, 2 00i generator-stacked boxes of Tyvek house wrap, and a brand-new Makita cordless drill kit she had purchased from a Lowe's in Everett. The cabin was currently nothing more than a wooden skeleton sitting on concrete pier blocks. But to Clara it was a palace. She had spent the last 3 weeks watching DIY construction tutorials on a downloaded iPad, learning how to frame walls and install floor joists. The physical toll was agonizing. Her lower back throbbed with persistent sciatica, and her hands were covered in rough, stinging blisters from wrestling with heavy 2x4s. Yet, every nail she drove into the wood felt like a nail in the coffin of her old, terrified life. Clara pulled on her heavy leather work gloves and grabbed her framing hammer. Today, she needed to finish securing the roof trusses before the notorious Pacific Northwest autumn storms rolled in. She dragged a heavy ladder to the side of the plywood flooring, her breathing heavy and labored. She climbed carefully, acutely aware of her shifted center of gravity. Balancing a piece of lumber while pregnant was a dangerous, stupid game, but she had no contractors to call. David had isolated her from her friends, and her parents had passed away years ago. It was just her and the baby. As Clara swung the hammer, The sharp crack of metal against steel echoed through the dense trees. She hit the nail again, sinking it deep into the wood. But as she reached for a second nail from her tool belt, the hairs on the back of her neck suddenly stood up. It was a primal, deeply ingrained instinct. The absolute silence of the woods had shifted. The birds had completely stopped chirping. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara froze on the ladder, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the dark tree line. Shadows danced between the massive trunks of the cedars. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to sound commanding. She gripped the heavy steel hammer, raising it like a weapon. "I have a shotgun in my car." She lied her eyes, frantically searching the underbrush. There was no answer. Only the gentle rustle of a fern frond settling back into place, as if something incredibly large and incredibly fast had just brushed past it. Clara stared at the spot for a long, agonizing minute. When nothing emerged, she slowly exhaled, blaming her frayed nerves and pregnancy hormones. She climbed down the ladder to grab a bottle of water, but when she walked around to the back of the unfinished cabin to retrieve her cooler, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, stacked neatly against the freshly installed plywood siding, was a massive pile of firewood. It was chopped into perfect uniform wedges, the pale wood still smelling fresh and sappy. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't chopped that wood. She didn't even own an axe. Someone had been here. Someone was watching her. For 3 days, Clara tried to convince herself that the firewood was a bizarre gesture from a wandering logger, or perhaps a peace offering from a reclusive neighbor Gary Henderson had forgotten to mention. She didn't touch the wood. Instead, she threw herself into the grueling work of wrapping the cabin in weatherproofing, driven by a panicked urgency. The sky above the Washington canopy had turned a bruised, violent purple, signaling the arrival of a massive coastal storm. The local radio station, crackling through her Subaru's speakers, warned of severe wind advisories and torrential freezing rain. By nightfall on the 3rd day, the storm hit with biblical fury. Clara was inside the drafty, unfinished cabin, huddled on an air mattress wrapped in 3 sleeping bags. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through the trees and violently shaking the wooden frame of her sanctuary. She had managed to staple heavy plastic sheeting over the empty window frames, but they snapped and billowed wildly under the pressure. The temperature had plummeted, and the small mister, heater buddy she had bought at a camping store, was struggling to take the edge off the freezing air. Suddenly, a loud tearing sound ripped through the noise of the storm. Clara gasped, sitting up. The heavy blue tarp she had secured over the unfinished roof trusses had torn loose on the north side. Freezing rain began pouring directly into the center of the cabin, instantly pooling on the plywood subfloor and creeping dangerously close to her portable generator. "No, no, no," Clara cried out, scrambling out of her sleeping bags. She threw on her heavy Carhartt jacket and grabbed a heavy-duty staple gun and a flashlight. She couldn't let the water ruin the floorboards. She didn't have the money to replace them. She pushed her way out of the makeshift plywood door into the roaring storm. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The icy rain felt like needles against her face as she dragged her ladder toward the north wall. She climbed up the ladder, slipping dangerously in the mud, her pregnant belly pressing awkwardly against the rungs. She grabbed the wildly flapping corner of the heavy tarp, struggling to pull it back over the exposed roof. It was like wrestling a sail in a hurricane. Her fingers were numb, completely devoid of strength, and her boots slipped on the wet rung. She was going to fall. Clara felt her balance give way, a scream tearing from her throat as the ladder tipped backward into the dark, freezing night. She threw her arms over her stomach, bracing for the devastating impact that would surely harm her baby. But she never hit the ground. Instead, she slammed into something solid, yet yielding. Strong, impossible arms wrapped around her waist, catching her mid-air with terrifying ease. Clara gasped, her eyes flying open in the darkness. She was set gently on her feet, on the muddy ground. She spun around, shining her blinding tactical flashlight directly into the face of her savior. Clara's breath vanished from her lungs. Standing before her in the torrential rain was a man. He was tall, broadly built, and wearing a heavy vintage Filson wool cruiser coat that looked like it had survived a century of rough winters. But it was his face that paralyzed her. He possessed a rugged, almost aristocratic jawline, high cheekbones, and skin that was impossibly, flawlessly pale. Raindrops cascaded down his thick dark hair, but he didn't seem to notice the freezing downpour at all. His eyes, catching the beam of her flashlight, flashed a brilliant luminescent crimson before settling into a deep, piercing amber. Before Clara could scream, the stranger stepped past her. He didn't climb the ladder. He simply reached up, grabbed the heavy tarp with one bare pale hand, and pulled it taut with a terrifying display of raw, effortless strength. In seconds, he had secured the heavy plastic over the roof, driving massive construction staples into the wood with his bare fist. He turned back to her, looking down at her trembling, drenched form. "You should be inside." His voice rumbled deep and impossibly smooth, cutting clearly through the roaring wind. Clara backed away, her hand instinctively flying to her swollen stomach. "Who are you?" she stammered, shivering violently as adrenaline and hypothermia began to battle for control of her body. "How did you catch me?" "My name is Dominic Hayes," he said, stepping out of the shadows. As he moved closer, Clara realized with a spike of sheer terror that she couldn't see his breath in the freezing air, despite the heavy vapor puffing from her own lips. "You bought land in my valley, Clara Jenkins." "How do you know my name?" she demanded, stepping back toward the cabin door, her hand desperately feeling for the heavy framing hammer she had left on a sawhorse's. Dominic's amber eyes flicked down to her stomach. His expression, previously unreadable and cold, suddenly shifted. A profound, ancient sorrow flashed across his features, followed instantly by a fiercely protective darkness. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I know many things that happen in these woods," Dominic said softly, his gaze locked on her belly. "I heard your heart racing for 3 days. But tonight I heard another heartbeat, a tiny, fragile rhythm fighting against the cold." Clara stared at him, bewildered and terrified. He was standing 10 feet away. It was medically impossible for him to hear a fetal heartbeat. "What are you?" she whispered, the hammer slipping from her numb fingers. Dominic closed the distance between them with a speed her eyes couldn't process. Suddenly, he was standing right in front of her, shielding her entirely from the biting wind. He didn't touch her, but the sheer magnetic force of his presence was overwhelming. He looked down at her, a lonely king who had guarded these shadowed forests in total isolation for 300 years. "I am the reason you have nothing to fear in the dark," Dominic murmured, his deep voice wrapping around her like a physical blanket. He gently placed his cold, marble-like hand hovering just an inch over her pregnant stomach. "You are running from a monster, Clara. But you're not alone anymore. And no one will ever touch you or this child again." The morning after the torrential storm broke clear and agonizingly bright. Clara woke up with a gasp, her hands flying instinctively to her rounded stomach. She was completely dry. More than that, she was incredibly warm. She blinked away the heavy fog of sleep sitting up on her air mattress and realized that a massive thermal-rated canvas blanket had been draped over her sleeping bags. A brand-new DeWalt portable propane heater hummed quietly in the corner of the room, throwing a steady wave of heat across the plywood floor. Panic seized her for a fleeting second as the memories of the previous night rushed back. The storm, the falling ladder, the impossibly pale man who had caught her mid-air and claimed he was a 300-year-old immortal. Clara pushed herself up, her joints aching and her lower back throbbing with the familiar dull pain of her third trimester. She fully expected to walk outside and find that it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. She unzipped the heavy plastic sheeting that served as her temporary front door and stepped out into the crisp, rain-washed morning air. Her breath hitched. The roof wasn't just covered, it was completely finished. Stacks of asphalt shingles that had been sitting untouched under a tarp yesterday were now perfectly installed, lined up with absolute mathematical precision. The heavy timber trusses were secured with hurricane ties, and the exterior of the cabin was fully wrapped in Tyvek. Work that would have taken a seasoned 3-man construction crew 4 days had been completed in a single night in the pitch black during a severe coastal storm. Dominic Hayes was sitting on a massive, uprooted cedar stump at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't wearing the heavy Filson coat anymore, just a fitted thermal Henley that stretched across his broad shoulders. He was perfectly still, his eyes closed, his face turned toward the pale morning sun. He looked like a marble statue abandoned in the Pacific Northwest woods. "You did all of this?" Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the absolute silence of the forest. Dominic opened his eyes. In the daylight, they weren't crimson. They were a rich, warm amber, like poured honey catching the sunlight. He stood up, moving with a predatory grace that made Clara's pulse spike. "The structure was sound, but your fasteners were inadequate for the wind load in this valley," he said simply, his deep voice resonating in her chest. "You were going to freeze Clara. I could not allow that." Clara crossed her arms over her chest, shivering, despite her heavy Carhartt jacket. "You told me last night that you are the reason there's nothing to fear in the dark. You don't breathe. Your hands were like ice. What are you, Dominic?" He took a slow step forward, stopping exactly 10 feet away to give her space. "I am what humanity has spent centuries writing cautionary tales about." He answered, his tone completely devoid of arrogance, laced only with a quiet resignation. "But I am not the monster from the movies. I don't sleep in a coffin, and I don't spontaneously combust in the sun. I am the oldest living apex predator in this region. I claimed this territory in the winter of 1712, long before the loggers and the state lines. I enforce the borders. I keep the more. Chaotic elements of my kind out of Washington. This valley is my absolute sanctuary. And I built a house in the middle of it." Clara said, her heart hammering wildly. She was standing face to face with a vampire. It defied all logic, all science, yet the perfectly shingled roof above her head was undeniable proof of his supernatural capabilities. "You did," Dominic agreed, a faint ghost of a smile touching the corners of his lips. "And for 3 weeks I watched you swing a framing hammer until your hands bled. I watched a terrified pregnant woman fight the wilderness with nothing but sheer willpower. I have seen empires fall and generations turn to dust, Clara, but I have rarely seen bravery like yours." While Clara was reluctantly beginning to trust the immortal king standing in her yard, a very human monster was closing in. 200 miles south, in a high-rise office in downtown Seattle, David Gallagher aggressively slammed a manila folder onto a glass conference table. David was a handsome, charismatic corporate lawyer, But his perfectly tailored Brooks Brothers suit hid a deeply dangerous, narcissistic obsession. Sitting across from him was Thomas Reed, a private investigator known for crossing ethical lines to get results. "I don't pay you $5,000 a week to tell me she disappeared into thin air." "Thomas," David snarled, his face flushed with violent rage. "She is 7 months pregnant with my child. She took my property. I want her found." Thomas calmly adjusted his glasses and pulled a printed spreadsheet from the folder. "She didn't disappear into thin air, David. She was smart. She dumped her phone and used cash, but she made one amateur mistake. She set up an LLC Jenkins Heritage Holdings. The state registry requires a registered agent. She used a third-party service, but I greased the palms of a paralegal at the firm." Thomas tapped a specific line on the paper. "The LLC purchased 5 acres of raw, unincorporated land in Skagit County, near Cedro Woolley." David's eyes darkened, a terrifying, triumphant smirk pulling at his mouth. "Get me the exact GPS coordinates. I'm going for a drive." Back in the woods, Clara finally let her guard drop. The physical exhaustion of pregnancy and sheer stress washed over her. She swayed slightly, her knees buckling. Before she could fall, Dominic was there. He moved faster than a blink, his strong arms catching her securely. He didn't feel like a monster. He felt like the safest place on earth. "I'm so tired," she whispered, tears of pure exhaustion finally spilling over her cheeks. Dominic gently scooped her up into his arms, holding her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. "I know, little bird," he murmured, carrying her toward the cabin. "Your war is over. Let me carry the weight now." Over the next 3 weeks, the unfinished cabin transformed into a fortress of warmth and safety. Clara was now 31 weeks pregnant, her center of gravity shifting so drastically that simply putting on her work boots required a monumental effort. But she didn't have to work anymore. Dominic Hayes had completely taken over. The lonely vampire king, who had spent centuries patrolling the darkest corners of the Pacific Northwest mountains, had surprisingly domestic skills. He worked exclusively at night, or in the deep shadows of the afternoon, moving with terrifying efficiency. He finished installing the drywall, set up a sophisticated off-grid solar array he had somehow procured, and hauled up the mountain himself and plumbed a freshwater catchment system. He also brought food. Every few days he would vanish into the woods and return with heavy paper grocery bags from a Safeway in Mount Vernon, packed with fresh vegetables, iron-rich cuts of beef, and prenatal vitamins. When Clara asked how he paid for it, he simply dropped a stack of pristine, crisp $100 bills from the 1980s onto the newly built kitchen counter. "I have amassed certain resources over the centuries," he had told her with a perfectly straight face. "Consider it an investment in the valley's newest residents." Despite his cold skin and predatory nature, Dominic was impossibly gentle with her. One evening, as Clara was sitting by the cast-iron wood stove, a sudden agonizing cramp ripped through her abdomen. She gasped, dropping her mug of tea, clutching her stomach as panic flared. Was it early labor? Was something wrong with the baby? Before the mug even hit the wooden floorboards, Dominic caught it. He knelt in front of her, his amber eyes wide with sudden alarm. "Clara, what is it?" "Pain," she hissed, squeezing her eyes shut as another wave of tightness gripped her belly. "It's too early. Dominic, it's too early." "Breathe," he commanded softly. Without asking, he placed his large, pale hands directly over her swollen stomach. Clara braced for the freezing touch, but instead she felt a strange humming vibration radiating from his palms. Dominic closed his eyes, his heightened supernatural senses diving deep into her physiology. He was perfectly still for 10 agonizing seconds. "It is not labor," Dominic finally said, opening his eyes, his voice steady and incredibly calming. "Your heart rate is elevated from panic, but the child's heartbeat is strong and rhythmic. 142 beats per minute. These are false contractions. Braxton Hicks, I believe the modern medical texts call them. The child is merely stretching, pressing against a nerve in your lower abdomen." Clara let out a massive, shaky breath, slumping back into the chair. "You can feel all of that." "I can hear the blood moving through your veins, Clara. I can hear the flutter of his tiny heart." Dominic murmured, his gaze softening as he looked at her stomach. He didn't pull his hands away. "He is perfectly healthy. You are perfectly healthy." The intimacy of the moment hung heavy in the air. Clara looked down at this ancient, terrifying creature who held her fragile life in his hands with such absolute reverence. "Why are you doing this for me, Dominic?" she asked softly. "You could have chased me off your land. You could have ignored me." Dominic looked up, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "I have lived for 300 years in absolute silence, Clara. I have protected these woods, but I have never had a reason to call them home. When I heard your heartbeat that first night fighting so desperately to survive, something in me woke up. You are the only light this dark forest has seen in centuries. I am not just protecting you because you are pregnant. I am protecting you because you belong to me now. This is your kingdom too." While a profound, unbreakable bond was solidifying in the heart of the ancient forest, a dark gray Ford F-150 rental truck was violently navigating the muddy, washed-out logging roads miles below. David Gallagher gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, a loaded 9mm Glock resting on the passenger seat. He had spent the morning violently interrogating Gary Henderson, the local real estate broker. David had cornered the older man behind his dingy office in Cedro Woolley, using his ruthless physical intimidation to force Gary into pulling up the exact plat map and GPS coordinates of Clara's property. "You don't want to go up there," Mr. Gary had warned, spitting blood onto the gravel after David had shoved him against a brick wall. "Those woods. The locals don't go past the river bend. Things go missing up there. Bad things happen in the dark." David had just laughed a cruel, soulless sound. "I'm the worst thing that's going to happen in those woods today, old man." Now the truck was clawing its way up the mountain. David checked the GPS on his phone. He was less than 3 miles away. He could already picture the look of sheer terror on Clara's face when he kicked the door in. He was going to take her back to Seattle. He was going to lock her away where she could never humiliate him by running again. Up at the cabin, Dominic suddenly stood up. The gentle protective warmth in his amber eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, luminescent crimson. The air around him seemed to drop 20 degrees. Clara frowned, shivering. "Dominic, what's wrong?" He turned his head toward the southern window, looking out into the dense, darkening pines. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tightening like coiled steel cables. The ancient predator had returned. "The forest is screaming!" Dominic growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous, inhuman baritone that shook the floorboards. "Someone has crossed the river boundary. A man with a violent heart." He slowly turned back to Clara, his crimson eyes blazing with the promise of absolute destruction. "Your monster has finally arrived, Clara. Stay inside. I am going to teach him why mortals should fear the dark." The mud on the Skagit County logging road was thick and treacherous, but David Gallagher drove the rented Ford F-150 with a reckless, entitled fury. The heavy truck fishtailed dangerously close to the steep ravine edge, the rushing waters of the Skagit River roaring somewhere far below in the darkening gorge. David didn't care about the danger. His mind was entirely consumed by a singular toxic objective. Clara was his. The baby she was carrying was his legacy. In David's narcissistic reality, nobody walked away from a senior partner at Gallagher & Associates without his explicit permission. He checked the GPS on his dashboard mounting bracket. 2 miles. The blue dot crawled agonizingly slowly across the digital map. The forest canopy above him had grown so dense that the afternoon light had completely surrendered to twilight. The towering Douglas firs seemed to press inward, their heavy branches scraping aggressively against the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers. "You think you can hide in a bunch of wet dirt?" Clara, David muttered to himself, his voice tight with adrenaline. He reached over to the passenger seat and ran his hand over the cold steel of the loaded 9mm Glock. He didn't plan to shoot her, of course. He just needed to remind her of the power dynamics. A little fear was an incredibly effective compliance tool. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered. The digital dashboard glitched the GPS screen, flashing a bright staticky green before dying completely. The engine sputtered, the heavy roar of the V8 suffocating, as if the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the air. "Come on, you piece of garbage," David snarled, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. The engine gave one final pathetic cough before dying altogether. The truck coasted to a halt in the deep mud, plunging David into absolute suffocating darkness. The silence that followed was immediate and unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a forest. It was a heavy, oppressive vacuum. The wind had stopped. The distant sound of the river had vanished. Cursing loudly, David grabbed the Glock, chambered around with a sharp clack, and shoved open the driver's side door. The freezing Washington air hit him like a physical blow, cutting straight through his expensive wool suit. He grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight from the center console and stepped out into the mud, his leather dress shoes sinking instantly. "Who's out there?" David yelled, his voice sounding thin and weak against the massive trees. "If this is some backwoods local joke, I am heavily armed, and I have the best defense attorneys in Seattle on speed dial." The only answer was a low resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of his shoes. Then the fog rolled in. It didn't drift naturally from the river. It poured rapidly from the tree line like thick dry ice swirling around David's knees in seconds. His heart rate spiked. He swept the heavy beam of the Maglite across the dense wall of pines. A shadow moved. It was impossibly fast, a blur of dark motion that defied the laws of physics, darting from one massive cedar trunk to another. David's breath hitched. He raised the Glock, his hand suddenly shaking. "I said show yourself!" He screamed, his polished arrogance cracking under the sheer weight of primal fear. "You speak of attorneys and laws mortal." A voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a deep velvet baritone that resonated with ancient authority, dripping with absolute contempt. "But human laws hold no jurisdiction in my kingdom, and you have trespassed in the valley of a king." David spun around, shining the light behind the truck. "Nothing." "Who are you? Are you the squatter helping Clara?" Suddenly, the heavy Maglite was ripped from David's hand with such terrifying force that his shoulder nearly dislocated. The metal cylinder was crushed midair like an empty soda can, the glass shattering violently before it was tossed casually into the mud. David cried out, stumbling backward against the hood of the truck, raising his gun blindly. Standing in the swirling mist, completely unfazed by the freezing temperature, was Dominic Hayes. His crimson eyes glowed with a terrifying luminescent intensity, casting a bloody light on the pale, flawless marble of his face. He wasn't wearing a coat. He didn't need one. He looked at David not as a rival man, but as a wolf looks at a wounded, pathetic rabbit. "You." David stammered, his mind unable to process the glowing eyes and the absolute stillness of the man standing before him. "Stay back." Dominic took a slow, deliberate step forward. The ground beneath his boots didn't even make a sound. "You have hunted a terrified pregnant woman across state lines. You have struck her, manipulated her, and sought to imprison her. You call yourself a man of power, David Gallagher." Dominic tilted his head, his crimson gaze piercing straight through David's skull. "Let us test that power against the dark." David panicked and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the silent woods. A hollow-point bullet tore straight toward Dominic's chest. Dominic didn't even flinch. He simply raised his hand. The bullet struck his open palm with a sickening thud and flattened completely against his skin as if it had hit a solid titanium vault door. The crushed lead dropped harmlessly into the mud. David let out a high-pitched hysterical sound, dropping the gun. He turned to run, but before his foot could even leave the ground, Dominic was there. The Vampire King's hand shot out, wrapping around David's throat with an iron, inescapable grip, lifting the 200-pound lawyer entirely off his feet. "Clara belongs to the forest now." Dominic whispered, his face inches from David's, his breath smelling of ozone and winter ice. "She is under my absolute protection. I am going to let you live, David. Not out of mercy, but because I need a messenger. You will walk back down this mountain. You will never speak her name again. If you ever look for her, if you ever cast a shadow in Skagit County again, I will not simply break your bones. I will tear your mind apart piece by piece, and I will feed your miserable soul to the pines. Do you understand?" David, suffocating tears of sheer terror freezing on his cheeks, managed a frantic, pathetic nod. Dominic's eyes flared, pushing a terrifying wave of supernatural compulsion straight into the lawyer's broken mind, searing the absolute command into his brain. Dominic dropped him into the mud. "Run," the immortal king commanded. David Gallagher didn't look back. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning his truck, his gun, and his pride, sprinting blindly into the freezing dark wilderness. Inside the cabin, the heavy crack of the distant gunshot echoed through the valley, sharp and unmistakable, even over the howling wind. Clara dropped her mug of chamomile tea. It shattered against the plywood floor, hot liquid splashing over her wool socks, but she didn't even feel it. Her heart stopped dead in her chest. "Dominic!" She breathed the name tearing from her throat in a desperate whisper. She rushed to the heavy plastic sheeting that covered the doorway, tearing it back. The storm outside had escalated into a full-blown blizzard. Heavy, wet snow was dumping from the sky in sideways sheets, burying the clearing in inches of white powder every hour. She couldn't see the tree line. She couldn't see anything. Panic, raw and suffocating, clawed at her throat. She knew David had a gun. She knew he was violent. Even knowing that Dominic was a 300-year-old supernatural predator, the human part of Clara's brain could only process the agonizing terror of losing the one person who had finally made her feel safe. "Please," she sobbed, wrapping her arms around her pregnant belly, standing in the freezing doorway. "Please come back. Please don't leave me alone." A shadow separated itself from the blizzard. Dominic walked into the clearing completely untouched by the raging storm. The snow seemed to part around him. His jaw was locked in a tight primal scowl, the lingering crimson fading slowly back to the warm, honeyed amber as he saw Clara standing in the cold. He crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her back inside, immediately kicking the makeshift door shut behind them to seal out the freezing wind. "I told you to stay by the fire," he scolded gently, though his voice was thick with lingering adrenaline. He set her down on the edge of the air mattress, pulling a heavy wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. Clara immediately grabbed his hands, turning them over frantically, checking his chest and his face for blood. I heard a gunshot. Dominic, I heard a gun. Did he shoot you? Is he dead? Dominic knelt before her, letting her desperate hands inspect his flawless skin. He shot at me. It was entirely ineffective. And no, Clara, he is not dead. Clara's eyes widened in sheer terror. You let him go. Dominic, he'll come back. He'll bring the police. He'll bring Thomas Reed, his investigator. He won't stop. He will stop, Dominic said, his voice dropping into a tone of such absolute terrifying certainty that it silenced her panic instantly. He reached up gently, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His cold fingers felt grounding against her flushed skin. I broke his mind, Clara. I forced a compulsion deep into his subconscious. He will completely forget the coordinates of this valley. The very thought of Skagit County will induce a physical paralyzing terror in his heart. He is currently running back to Seattle on foot. He will never, ever look for you again. The hunt is over. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving as the reality of his words washed over her. The suffocating nightmare she had lived in for 3 years, the constant looking over her shoulder, the burner phones, the fear was finally dead. She let out a ragged breaking sob and threw her arms around Dominic's neck, burying her face into his solid, unyielding shoulder. Dominic froze. For a creature who had lived in total self-imposed isolation since the 1700s, the sudden, fierce physical affection of a mortal woman was utterly overwhelming. Slowly, cautiously, his massive arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He closed his eyes, simply absorbing the frantic, beautiful rhythm of her heartbeat. You are safe now, my brave girl, he whispered against her hair. Clara pulled back slightly, looking deep into his amber eyes. I don't care what you are, Dominic. I don't care about the blood, or the centuries, or the darkness. You are the best man I have ever known. Before Dominic could respond to the staggering weight of her confession, Clara's face suddenly contorted in absolute agony. She gasped a sharp, ragged sound, and her hands flew to her swollen stomach. Her fingernails dug into Dominic's forearms with surprising strength. Clara! Dominic asked, his supernatural senses instantly flaring. It's not Braxton Hicks this time. Clara gritted out, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. Dominic, the pain. It's tearing my back apart. Dominic focused his hearing, his amber eyes widening in sudden, uncharacteristic alarm. He could hear the rapid, stressed fluttering of the baby's heart, but beneath that, he heard the undeniable, rhythmic, agonizing contractions of the uterine muscles. It wasn't a false alarm brought on by stress. The extreme terror of the afternoon had triggered a catastrophic physiological response. Clara looked down. A massive pool of clear fluid had just soaked through her heavy maternity jeans, dripping onto the plywood floor. My water just broke, Clara whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. She looked up at the vampire king, tears streaming down her face. Dominic, I'm only 32 weeks. He's too small. The baby is coming right now, and we're entirely snowed in. The ancient predator, who had just faced down a loaded gun without a single flinch, felt true paralyzing fear for the very first time in 300 years. The blizzard outside was howling, dropping feet of snow over the only logging road out of the valley. There was no hospital, no cellular service, and no modern medical equipment. Dominic scooped her up and laid her gently on the center of the bed, his mind racing through centuries of medical knowledge. He had seen countless births in the 18th and 19th centuries, but he also knew the devastating mortality rates of premature infants in the wild. I will not let you lose him. Dominic vowed stripping off his heavy Henley and tossing it aside, rolling up the sleeves of his thermal undershirt. He moved to the cast-iron stove, shoving massive logs into the fire to push the cabin's temperature to a sweltering heat. "You are the strongest woman in this world, Clara. We are going to do this together, but I need you to breathe." Another massive contraction ripped through Clara's body, and she screamed, the sound echoing into the merciless Washington blizzard. The ultimate fight for survival hadn't been against a violent ex-fiancé. It was happening right now, on the floor of a half-built cabin, where an immortal creature of death was about to fight against all odds, to bring a fragile, premature human life into the world. The interior of the cabin transformed into a sweltering high-stakes trauma ward. Outside, the Skagit County blizzard raged with an apocalyptic fury, burying the 2018 Subaru Forester under 3 feet of heavy wet snow and completely cutting the property off from the rest of the world. Even if David Gallagher had somehow managed to call Skagit Valley Hospital's emergency dispatch, no ambulance was getting up that logging road. They were entirely, utterly alone. Dominic moved with a terrifying, calculated precision. For a creature who had lived through the cholera epidemics of the 1800s and the brutal frontier winters of the Pacific Northwest Panic, was a foreign concept. He lit 3 heavy-duty Coleman LED lanterns, bathing the plywood room in stark, brilliant white light. From the supplies he had hoarded over the last few weeks, he retrieved a massive Johnson & Johnson trauma kit, sterilized scissors, and several bottles of purified Gerber infant water. Clara writhed on the air mattress, her fingers clawing into the heavy wool blankets. Another contraction hit her, tearing through her lower back with the force of a freight train. She let out a blood-curdling scream, her body bowing upward. The pain was blinding, a primal, suffocating agony that made her vision swim with dark spots. "Breathe with me, Clara," Dominic commanded, his deep baritone cutting through the haze of her pain. He was kneeling beside her, his flawless face intensely focused. He placed his ice-cold hands firmly against her lower spine. The sheer freezing temperature of his skin acted like an instant supernatural epidural, numbing the screaming nerve endings in her back. Clara gasped, her head falling back against the pillows as the contraction finally crested and broke. "It hurts too much," she sobbed, her face pale and shining with cold sweat. "Dominic, it's too early. His lungs. 32 weeks. His lungs aren't ready. We need a NICU. We need incubators. He has you, and he has me. That is all he needs." Dominic said, his voice unyielding and absolute. He leaned over her stomach, closing his eyes, letting his heightened senses penetrate the physical barriers of her body. His ears, capable of hearing a leaf fall a mile away, tuned entirely to the frantic, rapid flutter of the tiny heart inside her. His heart rate is 160. He is stressed, but he is fighting. You must fight with him. For 6 grueling hours the battle raged inside the tiny cabin. The wood stove hissed and popped, radiating a brutal heat that kept Clara from going into shock, while Dominic's freezing hands managed her soaring fever. Clara was losing strength rapidly. The chronic stress of running from David, combined with the severe physical trauma of premature labor, was draining her reserves. "I can't," Clara whimpered, her head lolling to the side as another wave of pressure hit her pelvis. "I can't do it anymore. Let me sleep. Just let me sleep." "No." Dominic's voice cracked like a bullwhip, losing its gentle edge for the first time. He gripped her face, forcing her to look into his glowing amber eyes. "You do not get to quit, Clara. You drove across the country. You swung a framing hammer in the freezing rain to build a fortress for this child. You survived a monster. You will not surrender to exhaustion. Now push." Clara screamed a raw guttural sound of pure maternal fury and pushed with everything she had left. Dominic's eyes widened in sudden sharp alarm. He pressed his ear closer to her abdomen. The rapid, steady flutter of the baby's heartbeat had suddenly hitched. It dropped dangerously, slowing to a sluggish, struggling rhythm. "The umbilical cord!" Dominic hissed, his immortal mind calculating the crisis in milliseconds. "It is wrapped around his neck. As he descends, it is choking him." Clara's eyes flew open in absolute terror. "Fix it, Dominic, please." Dominic didn't hesitate. He knew human anatomy better than any modern surgeon, having spent centuries putting broken bodies back together on battlefields. "This is going to hurt Clara." "I am sorry," he murmured. With impossible speed and precision, Dominic reached inside her. Clara shrieked in agony, her fingernails biting deep into his broad shoulders, drawing actual blood from the immortal king. Dominic ignored the pain. His long, perfectly steady fingers located the fragile, pulsing cord wrapped tightly around the infant's neck. Using a fraction of his terrifying strength, he gently hooked his finger under the slick membrane and pulled it over the baby's head, freeing the airway. "The cord is clear," Dominic announced, his voice tight with exertion. "The heart rate is stabilizing. But you must get him out now, Clara. The next contraction you push like your life depends on it, because his does." Clara nodded frantically, tears streaming into her hair. She braced her feet against the mattress. When the next wave of agonizing pressure hit, she didn't just push. She threw her entire soul into the effort, screaming until her vocal cords tore. "I have his head." Dominic said, his hands moving with supernatural gentleness. "One more, Clara. One more." With a final earth-shattering cry, Clara pushed. The pressure vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming emptiness. She fell back against the pillows, her chest heaving violently, gasping for the sweltering air of the cabin. She waited for the sound, the beautiful, chaotic sound of a crying baby. But there was only silence, the heavy, suffocating silence of the room, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the howling blizzard outside. Clara forced her eyes open, her heart turning to pure ice in her chest. Dominic was kneeling at the end of the bed, holding a tiny, fragile form in his massive, blood-stained hands. The baby was terrifyingly small, barely 4 pounds, and his skin was a deep, concerning shade of purple. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. "Dominic," Clara whispered the words, scraping out of her dry throat like broken glass. "Why isn't he crying, Dominic? Give him to me." Dominic didn't answer. For the first time in his 300-year existence, the vampire king looked genuinely terrified. He had cleared the baby's mouth and nose with a sterile bulb syringe moving with blinding speed. He was gently but firmly rubbing the tiny infant's chest and back, trying to stimulate the premature lungs. But the infant remained perfectly still. Dominic closed his eyes, throwing his supernatural hearing toward the tiny chest in his hands. The heartbeat was there, but it was fading rapidly, a fragile staccato rhythm that was shutting down. 32 weeks was simply too early. The lungs hadn't produced enough surfactant. The human body was failing. "He is fading." "Clara," Dominic said, his voice breaking a profoundly human sound of despair from an immortal predator. "No! No! You save him!" Clara screamed violently, thrashing against the blankets, trying to crawl toward them despite her agonizing pain. "You said you protect this valley. You said nothing dies here without your permission. Save my baby." Her words struck him like a physical blow. Dominic looked at the tiny, dying infant, and then up at the terrified, broken mother who had trusted him completely. He was a creature of death, cursed to walk in the shadows, feeding on the blood of the violent and the corrupt to sustain his own endless existence. He was a taker of life, but he could also give it. The ancient laws of his kind strictly forbade the sharing of immortal blood with mortals, let alone an infant. The power contained in a single drop of a 300-year-old vampire's blood was catastrophic. It could heal any wound, cure any disease, and rewrite cellular structures. But it was incredibly dangerous. It would bond the child to him forever. It would change him. Dominic looked at Clara's desperate, begging eyes. Let the laws burn, he thought. Without a word, Dominic brought his own wrist to his mouth. His jaw extended slightly, his sharp predatory incisors tearing directly into his own flawless marble skin. A thick, dark ribbon of immortal blood, richer and deeper than any human crimson, welled up instantly. "What are you doing?" Clara gasped. Dominic knelt down, bringing his bleeding wrist directly over the baby's pale, motionless lips. "I am keeping my promise," he whispered. He allowed exactly one drop of his blood to fall. It landed on the infant's lips, instantly absorbing into the fragile, premature skin. Dominic immediately pulled his wrist away, placing his cold hands firmly over the baby's chest, focusing every ounce of his ancient vibrating energy into the tiny body. For 2 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Then the baby's back arched violently. A sharp, ragged gasp tore through the silent cabin. The infant's chest heaved, pulling in a massive rush of oxygen. The terrifying purple hue of his skin instantly flushed into a bright, healthy pink as the immortal blood jump-started his failing circulatory system, forcing his premature lungs to expand and function with terrifying, unnatural strength. And then he cried. It wasn't a weak, premature whimper. It was a loud, furious, demanding wail that cut straight through the noise of the blizzard outside. It was the sound of absolute, victorious life. Clara burst into hysterical, uncontrollable sobs, reaching her arms out desperately. "Give him to me, please!" Dominic rapidly wrapped the screaming, thrashing infant in a sterile, warmed flannel blanket. His hands, previously shaking with ancient fear, were steady once again. He moved up the bed and placed the tiny bundle directly onto Clara's bare chest, pressing the baby skin to skin against her heart. Clara wrapped her arms around her son, burying her face into his damp, dark hair. "Oh, my God!" She wept, rocking him gently. "You're okay. You're okay, my sweet boy. Mommy's got you." Dominic stepped back, watching the beautiful, chaotic scene before him. He was covered in blood and sweat, his immortal body humming with the adrenaline of the fight. He had just defied the laws of nature and the laws of his own dark kind. As he watched Clara kiss the baby's head, he focused his hearing on the infant once more. The heartbeat was no longer weak. It was strong, steady, and thrumming, with a powerful, undeniable energy. But there was something else. A faint harmonic resonance in the infant's blood that exactly matched Dominic's own ancient pulse. The child was still human, but he carried the protection of the king in his veins now. He would never fall ill. He would be stronger, faster, and more resilient than any mortal man. The storm raged through the night, but inside the cabin there was only warmth and peace. By the time the morning sun finally broke through the dense clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the 3 feet of fresh Skagit County snow, Clara was fast asleep. The baby was perfectly content, nursing quietly. Dominic was sitting on a heavy oak chair he had dragged beside the bed, his amber eyes completely locked on the 2 mortals. His wrist had already healed, leaving absolutely no scar. Clara slowly blinked awake, looking down at her son, and then up at the immortal man who had saved them both. "I saw what you did," she said softly, her voice raspy from screaming. "With your wrist." Dominic didn't look away. "His lungs were failing, Clara. I had to force his cells to adapt. He is still human. He will grow, he will age, and he will walk in the sun. But he will never be vulnerable. My blood is in his veins now. He is part of me." Clara looked back down at the tiny, perfect face of her son. She didn't feel fear. She didn't feel the paralyzing dread that David had always instilled in her. She felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute security. The monster she had run from was gone, replaced by a monster who would gladly tear the world apart to keep them safe. "His name is Henry," Clara whispered, reaching out a tired hand toward Dominic. Dominic leaned forward, gently wrapping his large, cold hand around her warm, fragile fingers. He looked at the baby, a fierce, unbreakable vow solidifying in his glowing amber eyes. "Welcome to the world, Henry," the Vampire King murmured. "You have nothing to fear in the dark. Not anymore." 5 years later, the brutal Skagit County winters had come and gone, but the clearing deep in the Washington wilderness had completely transformed. The unfinished, drafty plywood skeleton Clara had once desperately hammered together in the freezing rain was now a breathtaking, sprawling, timber-framed home. Massive red cedar logs supported a sweeping roofline. Solar arrays gleamed in the afternoon sun, and a thriving greenhouse sat securely near the tree line. It was a fortress of warmth and light, hidden perfectly within the ancient domain of the immortal king. Clara Jenkins, now 33, stood on the expansive wraparound porch, wiping dirt from her gardening gloves. She looked completely different. The haunting shadows of fear that used to live in her eyes had been entirely erased, replaced by a fierce, undeniable strength. She was the matriarch of this wild territory, now untouchable and deeply loved. A joyous shriek echoed from the dense canopy of a towering Douglas fir. "Henry, you are entirely too high," Clara called out, leaning over the wooden railing, though the panic that usually grips a mother was notably absent from her voice. Nearly 40 feet off the ground, 5-year-old Henry laughed. He was a wildly energetic child, with Clara's bright eyes navigating the massive branches with an agility that defied human biology. He moved like a predator, entirely fearless. "I'm looking for the eagles, Mom," Henry shouted down. "The eagles are nesting further up the ridge, little wolf." A deep velvet baritone resonated from the shadows. Dominic stepped out from the dense shade into the dappled afternoon light, wearing a heavy flannel shirt completely unfazed by the autumn chill. His glowing amber eyes were locked warmly on the small boy. "Come down, Henry," Dominic commanded gently. "Your mother has finished the harvest, and it is time to go inside." Henry didn't bother climbing down. With a joyous laugh, the 5-year-old simply stepped off the 40-foot branch. For a normal human child, it would have been a fatal fall. But Henry was not entirely normal. The single drop of immortal blood Dominic had given him on the night of his birth had fundamentally altered his physiology, giving him a bone density that made him virtually indestructible. Furthermore, he was never in any real danger when the king of the valley was standing beneath him. Dominic moved with blinding supernatural speed. He effortlessly caught the falling boy out of midair, absorbing the impact with grace. Henry giggled, wrapping his arms around Dominic's neck, completely accustomed to his father's strength. "You encourage him," Clara scolded playfully as Dominic walked up the steps. "He is learning the boundaries of his strength." Dominic replied, a profound, paternal affection softening his face. He pressed a cold, gentle kiss to Clara's forehead. "He needs to know he can fall, and that I will always catch him." Later that evening, Claire and Dominic sat on the heavy leather sofa in front of the roaring wood stove. Claire rested her head against Dominic's solid chest, listening to the absolute stillness beneath his ribs. To her, his silence was the sound of absolute safety. "Thomas Reed made the news today," Clara murmured. "He was arrested in Seattle for wire fraud." Dominic's arm tightened instinctively around her waist. "And David? Still exactly where you put him," Clara said softly. David Gallagher had never returned. When he stumbled out of the woods 5 years ago, his mind was entirely fractured by Dominic's compulsion. He had spent the last 5 years in a high-security psychiatric facility in Oregon, paralyzed by severe dendrophobia and irrational, suffocating terror of trees. He couldn't even look out a window without a violent panic attack. The monster who had tormented Clara had been thoroughly destroyed. "He will remain a ghost," Dominic stated, his voice dropping into the uncompromising tone of a king. "He does not exist in our world anymore." Clara tilted her head up, looking into his ancient eyes. "Did you ever think in all those centuries alone in the dark that you would end up raising a human child and building a greenhouse?" Dominic shifted his long, marble-cool fingers, gently cradling her jaw. "For 300 years, I thought my only purpose was to be a warden of the dark. I watched empires fall, and I felt absolutely nothing. But the night I saw you fighting that storm, you brought the dawn into my valley, Clara. My soul recognized what it had been waiting for. I'm going to grow old, Dominic." Clara whispered a vulnerable truth hanging in the warm air. "Henry is going to grow up, and I am going to age. I won't always be this strong." Dominic's eyes flared a brilliant gold in the firelight. "You will always be my queen," he vowed, his voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "I will love you through every season of your mortal life. I will worship every line time draws on your face. And when you are finally tired, when you are ready to leave the sun behind—" He paused, his lips brushing softly against hers. "I will share the dark with you, Clara. We have forever, and I am never letting you go." Clara closed her eyes, pulling the lonely immortal king into a deep kiss. She had walked into the haunted woods a broken runaway, but she had emerged as the undisputed queen of the shadows. As the wind howled outside, Clara knew with absolute certainty she would never be alone again. What a breathtaking journey! From a terrified, expecting mother swinging a hammer in the freezing rain to the powerful queen of a supernatural kingdom, Clara's story proves that sometimes the most terrifying monsters in the woods are actually the ones meant to protect us forever. Dominic didn't just save her life. He gave her and Henry an eternal sanctuary. What did you think of that incredible birth scene in the blizzard? Would you trust a vampire king to protect your family off the grid? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this heart-pounding romance, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more epic original stories.